Hello and welcome to American Friction, the weekly US politics podcast out every Friday from the makers of Oh God What Now, The Bunker and Paper Cuts. I'm Jacob Jarvis. Every week we pick through the latest from the weird and scandalous world of American politics and try to make it make sense as much as it ever can, anyway. And helping to guide us through is Rolling Stone magazine politics reporter Nikki McCann-Ramirez. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Jar.
Nikki, usually our friend Chris is with us, but he's ill today. Aww. So he's not. But as we head into winter and, nasty little bugs and germs are flying around and people might be getting sick, like Chris is today. What's your go-to TV show when you're ill?
I'm going to say What We Do in the Shadows.
Nice.
That's been like my brain dead,
Yeah.
funny comedy right now. The other thing is I like watching like girly comedy movies from the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Your Mean Girls,
Oof.
your White Chicks.
Yeah.
Your musicals.
Nice.
I have to watch Hairspray. That one's like in the back of my mind.
Okay.
I'm like, I want to rewatch Hairspray.
I went to see Rocky Horror Picture Show last week, so that's my musical. So good.
Science fiction.
Jason Donovan,
Double feature.
What a guy, man. It was so good. Yeah, mine, I'll go for my highbrow one and then my lowbrow one. So highbrow, Sopranos, Pine Barrens, fucking like the best TV show episode ever. I just rewatch it whenever.
I've never seen The Sopranos.
Okay, well, that's some homework for you. And then my lowbrow one, which even just annoys myself, is I will go to season finales of The Walking Dead and watch them. Like from random seasons. Like I'll just watch like the farm when they're running around and Herschel's getting away. Yeah, it's a real waste of time. So they're my go-tos. But anyway, if anyone wants those recommendations, if they're feeling ill, like Chris is, you can watch them. And Chris, get better soon, and maybe you could watch some of them. So let's get on to the episode. We're going to be discussing a scandalous time for politicians, as I mentioned in the first intro. So from Trump saying that Jews will be to blame if he loses, which... why would he say that? But he did. Through to a governor scandal that is almost too weird to explain. Then an affair which has baffled everyone, and corruption allegations against New York's mayor. So there's a lot to get through in the scandal sphere. And we'll be speaking to Peter Baker of the New York Times about the state of play in the race, what Biden's up to, Harris's latest TV interview, and what he thinks to Trump saying that he won't run again if he loses. There's a lot, Nikki. There's a lot to get through.
There's a lot.
It really is. And it's just you and me, so we've got a lot of heavy lifting to do. Welcome back. You're listening to American Friction. Before we start, I've got a very quick favour to ask of you. What we want to do is to engage with all of you a little bit more. We've been really, really heartened, I would say, by how many of you are listening, but we want to speak to you. We want to get to know you. So if you enjoy what we're doing, leave us a review where you're listening, leave a comment if you're on Spotify, and then if you're on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, come say hello at American Frick. That's at American FRIC. Ask us a question, come say hello, tell us we're wrong about something. We just want to speak with you. So, right, on to the show. It's been a grim week in politics in the US with scandals all over the place. One that's not a scandal per se, though, is pretty outrageous. Trump is just fully refusing to debate Harris, basically. Nikki, thoughts on this, and has he just lost his fighting spirit?
I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. He got absolutely trounced in his first debate against her, and we'll talk a little bit about it with Peter later in the show, but debates nowadays are less about highbrow discussions about the issues and more about creating moments that your campaign can weaponize. And the Harris campaign got a gold mine out of Trump in that debate regarding how unhinged and unstable he was. I think his campaign knows that if they put him on a stage next to her again, it's probably going to be a repeat of what we already saw.
Yeah, I think it is quite, it's just strange that he's been so cowardly for someone who's apparently so macho. But he can't use the song Macho Man anymore, can he? So maybe...
Nope.
Maybe that's why. On to another thing then about Trump. This was linked to something we've discussed before, but he faces criminal charges over his cat comments. Could anything actually come of that, and might that rein him in somewhat, or is it largely kind of a gesture, symbolic, pushing against it, or could he actually be in some trouble there?
I mean, it could. So Ohio has a law that allows private citizens to file for criminal charges against another individual, and basically it requires prosecutors to take a look at those charges and determine if there's an arrest warrant or if that affidavit should be referred to a prosecutorial office for further investigation, like a grand jury type thing. The thing that happened here is a nonprofit that represents Haitian migrants throughout the country. They're based in California, but they have a lot of representation throughout the country. Filed charges against Vance and Trump, accusing them of spreading all these false rumors, but through those false claims, engineering harassment against members of the city, residents of the town, misusing public services or misdirecting public services, because as we talked about, Springfield got a bunch of bomb threats. So that meant that the city had to redirect security services, police, ambulances, that kind of thing, to those locations to deal with hoax bomb threats instead of actually doing the jobs that they need to be doing, and therefore putting residents in the town at risk. Those are kind of the lines of the indictment. Also, there's some stuff in there about misusing telecommunications, basically using public airwaves to spread false claims. I think there is a chance that a prosecutor picks this up. We know that both the governor of Ohio and the mayor of Springfield are really upset about this. Both of them are Republicans. And Trump is a private citizen at this point. He doesn't have the protections of immunity afforded to him by the office of a president. Even if he was president right now, this is not an official act. He's not making an official act in the capacity of a president. So he doesn't enjoy that umbrella coverage of immunity. So something could come out of it, but there is always the consideration that it would be lengthy. There are major questions around what would happen if Trump wins in any of the court cases he's involved in. Essentially, would they be tanked? Would they disappear? Would they have to wait 4 years until he leaves office in order to continue? So I think symbolically it does make a statement. I think there is a chance it gets picked up. I don't think we'll see any progress on it for a significant amount of time if it does.
On another Trump own goal then, as he just, every time he opens his mouth, seems to say something very offensive. He essentially said that Jewish voters would be to blame if he loses the election, but was doing it in a kind of a pitch of suggesting that he's the guy to fight anti-Semitism as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know how that checks out by doing anti-Semitism by saying to say that you're against it. A lot of layers of logic there. Talk me through it. I mean, I'm sorry to ask you to try and get into Trump's brain here, but why would he say this? What was he getting at?
Yeah. The thing here is that what Trump is doing, and it's not just this, he's been saying these kinds of things about Jewish people in the United States for years now, but it is a kind of strange inversion of the anti-Semitic trope that is leveled against Jewish people of dual loyalty. This idea that all Jewish people in the United States have an inherent loyalty to Israel that makes them untrustworthy. This is a really common anti-Semitic trope that is leveled against Jewish people. But what Trump is doing and has done in the past is basically argue that since as president, he had such a favorable policy toward Israel, he made so many concessions to Israel through the Abraham Accords, through moving the embassy permanently to Jerusalem, through allowing Israel to permanently take control of the Golan Heights, that Jews in the United States therefore owe him their vote. Does that make sense? This idea that because Trump has been so nice to Israel, American Jews therefore owe him his vote, even though many American Jewish people have no connection to Israel, do not support their government or their policies, have no stake in what's going on over there. It's, again, weaponizing this trope of dual loyalty in a way that services himself. But fundamentally, it is based in this anti-Semitic idea that Jewish people owe support to people who are nice to Israel, which is not necessarily true and has become even more clear in the context of the war in Gaza, where you have thousands and thousands of American Jews very vocally opposing the policies of the Israeli government.
I've looked at some polling actually linked around this as well. So the Jewish Democratic Council of America did some polling towards the end of August into September, where Trump had said something along the similar lines, that said that any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion and should be ashamed of themselves. Most American Jews who were asked disagreed with this, as you might expect, 80%. And among those who disagree with Trump's statement, 84% believe it to be anti-Semitic, which, again, yeah. But it seems so strange as well when you look at these findings that American Jews are highly concerned about anti-Semitism as well, 91%, and 66% of them are very concerned. So it's just such a backfire and such an indelicate thing to talk about, particularly as well than just looking at the top line. If you match him and Harris up, 72% of American Jews for Harris, 25% for him. So what a colossal misstep if he wants to make any gains there to just... Yeah, it really does beg a belief. We mentioned very briefly, as we were recording last week, Mark Robinson. So something was going on, something was rumbling there. Me and Chris were a little bit like, we don't really totally know who this guy is, what's going on. But your phone was going off. You were getting pinged. Just what the fuck has gone on there? Because I know some people might have read a little bit about this, but it seems like every single day it gets weirder and weirder and worse for him. He's the lieutenant governor of North Carolina at the moment, right? But he's running to be the governor. So a reasonably big deal in Republican Party circles.
Very big deal, particularly because he was essentially handpicked by Trump amongst the slate of Republican candidates in North Carolina for this ticket.
Trump has good judgment of character.
Great judgment. Great judgment. Yeah. Trump called him Martin Luther King Jr. on steroids. They appeared together at a ton of rallies. They were just, all up in each other's business, campaigning for each other. And what essentially happened last week, right after we stopped recording the pod, I think it came out pretty late Thursday night, was that CNN had tracked down a bunch of old posts from Robinson on a porn message board. The message board was called Nude Africa, and it was like a very early 2000s place where people would share pornography and they could comment on stuff. But in these comments, Mark Robinson was calling himself a black Nazi. There's one quote that says, quote, "Slavery is not bad. Some people need to be slaves. I wish they would bring it, parentheses, slavery back. I would certainly buy a few."
Fuck me.
It's...
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's really bad. And this is among just a slew of other, really gross, just, pornographic comments. Other people who've gone on the message board and, tracked down this account have pointed to other posts where he was allegedly, because I'm not sure if these have been fully confirmed, claiming to have an affair with his wife's sister that was described in really graphic and gross details. Robinson, throughout this campaign and throughout his political career, has been incredibly transphobic in the most vitriolic terms.
Yeah, completely.
He discussed that he enjoyed watching porn featuring transgender individuals. I'm not going to say the word he actually used because it's a slur. He talked about, as a candidate, he's really promoted bathroom bills and efforts to restrict transgender people's ability to use bathrooms aligning with the gender they identified with. And then he, in these posts, talked about, as a teenager, spying on women who were showering in locker rooms. So it's just it's a demonstration of how, unsurprisingly, hypocritical these people are and how they will engage in awful, gross behavior and then turn around and accuse vulnerable populations of being the real problem. But basically, the fallout of this has been that a bunch of high-level staffers within his campaign have quit. there's a bit of a crisis within North Carolina Republicans about what are they going to do because the election is in 5 weeks and this guy is really tied to Donald Trump. And Trump has kind of stopped talking about him. He's campaigned twice in North Carolina in the last week and hasn't mentioned him once. He, I think, maybe was scheduled to appear with Trump and then like backed out at the last minute after all this broke. But North Carolina is a critical battleground state in this election cycle. And now the fear among Republicans is what if this Mark Robinson debacle drags Trump down in the general?
Yeah, it's a strange thing about this though as well. What I'm struggling to wrap my head around is that he had publicly said stuff like he said that trans women should find a corner outside somewhere to go to the bathroom rather than use women's bathrooms, and he equated LGBTQ plus people to maggots and called homosexuality and what he called transgenderism filth. Why is this cut through?
I think because there is a really salacious aspect to it. Like, there's nothing Americans love more than a freaky sex scandal. Like, so much of our politics has been defined by weird sex scandals. But I think that was one of the main components that brought up a lot of attention to it. It was when we first got reports of this, the first thing we heard was there's going to be an insane report coming out about Mark Robinson. It seems like it's sexual in nature. And I think part of it is also that among Republicans, attacks on transgender people are accepted. Attacks on the LGBTQ community are accepted by and large. And a lot of the people making these attacks present an identity for themselves that is religious, that is family values oriented, that is opposed to, degeneracy and licentiousness and weird sexual proclivities. And for someone like Mark Robinson, who has couched so much of his political identity as being like a militantly Christian man, to, be caught on porn forums talking about all sorts of kinks and things he likes, while at the same time talking about how he's a black Nazi and he thinks slavery should come back. And to be clear, Mark Robinson, for our audience who hasn't seen him, he is a black man. So there is another layer to that about sort of the attacks against one's own community that are also really resonating. Robinson has this report, these findings have also just imploded the public persona that Robinson is presenting, because this is also not the first time he's had like revelations about him relating to porn. There was a report, I think last year, from some guys who, I don't know if you have this in the UK, but in the United States, if you're driving down like highways or like kind of remote areas, there are basically like brick and mortar pornography stores where you can walk in.
My car broke down outside a sex store on a random motorway, and it was really
a likely story, Jarv.
Yeah,
likely story.
But I kept having to call up, and they're like, "Where are you?" And I was outside somewhere called like Sparkles and Whips on the like on an A road. It was so embarrassing because I was just like, "That's the only fucking thing I can see. I don't know where I am." So yeah, we have them. It's
okay, Jarv. Me and our audience of thousands of people won't tell anyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
But basically, there was this reporting that came out from employees that worked at one of these stores that Mark Robinson was a frequent customer and, would buy bootleg porn videos off of them, would come in like a couple times a week to preview videos. And again, it's chipping away at that facade he puts out of being like an upstanding Christian man who is using his religion and his self-righteousness to put down vulnerable populations and accusing them of being the type of degenerates that he actually is.
On to one final scandal before we get into it. This is a Democratic Party one. So what is going on with Eric Adams? So there's been charges opened up on Thursday, I believe. Talk me through a little bit what's going on there. Bribery, wiretapping.
Oh,
it seems very kind of Ocean's 11-y. I don't know, maybe Watergate would have been a smarter thing to say. I don't know, but it just seems kind of weird.
I'm going to try and synthesize this down because it is actually, as someone who's had to write about it, pretty complex. We've known for more than a year now that New York City Mayor Eric Adams, this is his first term, his administration has been caught in a series of overlapping federal investigations against like high-level members of his administration. Not all of them are connected. There are about 4 to 5, depending on whether some of them end up being connected. But what essentially has been happening is that there have been subpoenas, seizures of records, raids of homes, seizures of electronics among all these prominent members of the New York City government. We just saw a string of really high-profile resignations over the past 2 weeks that indicated that some sort of bubble was about to burst. It was like, something's going on. We don't know what it is yet, but like people are fleeing. And a year ago, Adams's electronics were seized by the FBI. So we knew at least one of these investigations had to do with Eric Adams. And then Wednesday night, reports start coming out that he's been indicted over something. Thursday morning, indictment is unsealed. Essentially, what Adams has been accused of is laundering funds from foreign nationals, from Turkey specifically, into his 2021 mayoral campaign. And there's a couple layers to this. He was getting direct funding that he was then laundering through what are called straw donations. Essentially, someone from a foreign entity gave him money. They then disguised that donation as if it came from a citizen of New York and entered it into the campaign funds. New York City has a program that matches donations for candidates. So the idea with this program was that they wanted more local candidates, people who weren't necessarily funded by like big Democratic donors, to run in New York City. So to give those candidates a leg up, the city started matching campaign donations. So not only did he receive, I think it was upwards of like $20,000 just in direct illegal campaign donations, he then converted those donations into hundreds of thousands of dollars in public funds through this matching program that his campaign should not have received. On top of that, these Turkish officials who were not named in the indictment were paying more than $100,000 in like luxury trips and travel for Adams and his like, I guess, staffers, friends, companions, like luxury trips to China, stays in the Ritz-Carlton in like Turkey, in France, first class flights on major airlines that cost like upwards of $16,000. And Adams was hiding these sort of perks that he was getting, disguising them, basically coordinating with these Turkish officials to make it look like, oh, he paid $600 for a flight that actually cost upwards of $10,000. And essentially, it's a corruption case. It's bribery. They have evidence that the Turkish government and these Turkish officials then went back to Adams and said, hey, we're opening a brand new consulate. It's like a 36-story skyscraper in New York City. It's not up to code. We want you to tell the fire department to not inspect the building. And Adams did. So there is also evidence that Adams directly coordinated with foreign nationals to skirt the laws of the New York government. And it's ugly. It's very messy. We will likely see more indictments because it seems that several more people from his administration are implicated in this scheme. But then not only that, my theory is that through the investigation into Adams, they have now uncovered wrongdoing amongst other members of his administration. And that's why we have, 3 other cases that will probably result in indictments or further investigation that are still pending. it's messy. It's really messy.
For the election, then, just to wrap up this, is it kind of similar to the, with the scandals with people who are linked to Trump? Might this it adds a lot of noise around the Democrats, and it adds that in New York, if people associate with Eric Adams as being corrupt, it may be links that people think, well, the Democratic Party is corrupt, which could affect higher ballot votes and then the presidential. Is that basically the uptick of what this might mean?
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of a pain in the ass that so many of the recent criminal cases against Democratic politicians, your Menendez, your Eric Adams, have come from the New York, New Jersey area, which is very blue. But I do think there are some implications for the election here. So in 2022, I believe, the 2022 midterms, and in 2020, New York is by and large a blue state. Overall, it will go blue. But it does have some rural districts that are a little tighter, that can swing red or can swing blue. And part of the reason the Republican Party now has a really narrow majority in the House of Representatives is because they managed to flip some blue Democratic seats to Republican. And in this election cycle, Democrats have been putting a ton of energy into recapturing those districts. So when you have a scandal like this within New York politics so close to the election, that could damage those efforts. And I think Nancy Pelosi said earlier this week that if Democrats manage to take back those seats in New York, they could retake the House. So, concerning.
Since Joe Biden dropped out of the race, there has been less focus than you might expect on the actual sitting president of the United States, with all eyes now on Harris. Peter Baker, though, is someone who is still very much keeping tabs on the president as the New York Times' chief White House correspondent, and he joins us today. Hi, Peter.
Hey, how are you?
Very good, thank you. You?
I'm good.
Good. So, Peter, what is the feeling like around the White House now that Biden has pulled out of the race, and there being how are they handling with there being such a long period of time where it feels like there is a lame duck president?
Yeah, it really does feel different. You walk through the corridors of the West Wing right now, and it's kind of like high school at the end of senior year, right? I mean, there's kind of this sense that we know the end is coming. It's just a few months away. People are already drifting away. Some have left to go work on the campaign or left to go someplace else or thinking about where they're going to go in a couple months. So it definitely has sort of a not kind of a crickets feel, but kind of a sense that the energy is drained away. Everybody understands that the attention now is on the campaign trail, on the vice president, on the former president, and that, Joe Biden is kind of a third wheel in a way in that conversation. But having said that, of course, there's still a lot going on, and it is on his plate where he got two wars that he is trying to figure out, one in Europe, one in the Middle East. It seems to be getting worse in the Middle East. And so it's not that he doesn't have a lot going on right now. It's just that he's probably not at the top of the spotlight right now, given the campaign.
How did it feel like Biden personally is handling that? Is he seeming to, enjoying being under somewhat less scrutiny? And I suppose more widely, there is a concern to that as well, isn't there, that Biden is kind of under much less scrutiny than he would be at this point?
Yeah, I think for Biden, it depends on the day and depends on the moment in some ways. Mostly I think he's resigned to the situation. I don't think he's happy about it, but he's come around to understand it was probably the best decision. But I think there are moments where it still hurts, right? His own allies, his own Democratic, allies through thick and thin all this time are the ones who turned on him, the ones who basically shoved him out the door. And I think that's a painful thing for somebody who has spent a lifetime in politics, a lifetime in Washington, trying to get to the place he's at right now. So as he's watching all the attention bleed away to somebody else, for somebody who wanted to be president, still wanted to be president for the next 4 years, it's a complicated and probably not ideal moment.
What do you feel like is maybe going the most under the radar in terms of what he is doing at the moment? And where do you think there maybe should be more focus back on the White House? And in terms of how that links in with the election race, I suppose Harris is trying to, in some ways, distance herself, in some ways wanting to use the positive aspects of Biden's legacy. So where does that fall at the moment?
Yeah, look, she's trying to be the change agent. And that's why you don't really see Biden out on the campaign trail very much. He said when he dropped out and endorsed Kamala Harris, that he would be out there campaigning vigorously for her, but he really hasn't been. You don't see him out there doing rallies. You don't see him on the campaign trail. And I think that's in part because she really, while she's not consciously distancing herself from him in the sense that she doesn't, want anything to do with him. She doesn't want to remind people that she's an incumbent. She wants to be the change agent. Her slogan, in effect, is, we're not going back. Well, what that means is that she is looking forward. She's the future-oriented person, and Biden is the past. And in some ways, she, without being explicit, has positioned herself in some ways as much against him as she has against Trump, because she is the new face on the block, in effect. And she's saying, she likes Biden, obviously respects him. She had a lot to do with his administration where it was good, nothing to do with it when it was bad, apparently. But she doesn't want to be tied into it. She wants to be almost as if she was a challenger, in effect, to the establishment.
On the past side of things there, I suppose, with Biden then, is a lot of his focus also going on trying to secure his own legacy? And with that, as you say, there is focus around him on foreign policy, but domestically at the moment, what are you kind of interested in that he's doing, and what maybe are we from afar not noticing?
Yeah, like just last week, he gave a speech to the Economic Club of Washington, which is intended, I think, to seal his legacy. It was right after the interest rates came down, and he wanted to declare victory, in effect, over inflation. He wanted to make the case that Bidenomics, which is a term that didn't work politically, has achieved some real successes. And he has some things to argue about that when it comes to the record. But, the biggest thing in terms of his legacy, at least domestically, will be the outcome of the election. If she wins, then his legacy will be that he was the one who beat Trump 4 years ago and made it possible for Kamala Harris to keep Trump out of the White House 4 years later. If she loses, then a lot of people are going to blame him. A lot of people are going to say that it was his hubris in refusing to step aside earlier, that it was his stubbornness, that his own failure to recognize that his age was creeping up on him and would make a reelection campaign difficult, if not impossible. And so really, he has almost as much at stake in terms of the outcome in 45, 50 days, whatever it is, as she does.
I think one of the defining sort of attack lines against Harris that we've seen in this very brief campaign she's had is this idea that her time in the Biden administration is a bit of like an anvil around her. And I'm curious, in your view, where the gaps are still, where she has to answer for her time in the Biden administration, where she still needs to do more to distance herself from Biden, particularly on like issues including the Gaza war and the economy, the border czar situation.
Yeah, no, exactly. Look, Kamala Harris gave a speech just yesterday on the economy, on her economic plan, and then gave an interview to Stephanie Ruhle of MSNBC about the economics. And she laid out some ideas that will be popular among Democrats, presumably, increased child tax credit, help for small businesses that are trying to start out. And promising to go after corporations that are price gouging their customers. But the obvious question is, okay, fine, why didn't you do that before, right? Why didn't you do that 2 years ago when inflation was at 9% rather than now when inflation is under 3% or so? And I think that that's a hard question for her to answer because, of course, she wasn't really in charge over the last 3 years. You're the vice president, not the president. So you have some ownership over the things that happen, particularly the things that you're assigned to do, like the border, which you mentioned. She obviously was assigned to attack the root causes of illegal immigration in Central America, and you can hold her account for that. But do you hold her account for the decisions that Biden made and the way that he chose to approach it? She can't directly say, I would have done it differently than him, because that would seem disloyal. But in effect, that's what she's trying to do here.
In the vein of the interview last night, it's being billed as Kamala Harris's first sort of solo interview with a major publication. I think if you dig a little, it's pretty clear that she's been doing solo interviews with podcasts, radio shows, sort of more targeted media outlets that are speaking to specific demographics that they really need to win this election cycle. I'm curious, from your vantage point, what this sort of dynamic between Harris and the media is turning into and how it's affecting this campaign. This idea that she's not giving enough space to the major publications. Is it really something to do with her not being able to handle these kind of interviews, which I don't necessarily believe? Or is it an intentional campaign strategy on their part?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, as a reporter, obviously, we want her to give
we want all
more
the
interviews,
access.
right? You know, my phone number is public, I think. My email certainly is. Give a call. I'm ready anytime. So, yes, we think, professionally that presidential candidates should give as many interviews as we can possibly handle in a campaign season, because we have a lot of questions. And I think that that's important. I do think that when you're running for the highest office in the land, the most powerful office in the world, you ought to be able to handle questions. And I think that for her, the bigger question is not whether she can handle it, is whether people perceive that she can handle it, whether people perceive that she's ducking hard questions. Now, she's going to say, look, I went through a debate with Donald Trump for 90 minutes. Those were hard questions. Obviously, I'm not afraid of him. I'd have another debate, she's saying. And Donald Trump is the one who's afraid to debate me again. So that's her main answer, I think, on that question. It's mostly just a conversation piece. I don't know how much this affects voters. Voters have made up their mind a long time ago about what they think about Donald Trump. And they're making up their mind now about what they think about Kamala Harris, partly in opposition to Donald Trump. And I don't know that people outside of our business, Nikki, really care too much if she's given an interview to the New York Times. I think she should give one to the New York Times. I think she should give one to the Washington Post and Rolling Stone and to American Fiction Podcast. And I think she should do as many as possible. But they're looking at this like, what do we have to do for the next 45 days not to screw up? Don't take a chance. It's the physician's oath. First, do no harm. And if interviews are a potential for stumbles, then why take the chance? You're not going to pay much of a price for stiffing the media. Nobody ever does. But you might pay a price if you stumble and create a meme that the other side can use against you.
With that, I suppose, have you found it difficult in terms of juggling the holding Harris to a standard compared to also the standard of holding Trump and what you hold him to? Because on this, this notion that she's not giving interviews to anyone but friendly outlets. I mean, Trump, I think he's called Hannity like it's dozens of times. He just phones up to Fox and he speaks to people who he knows will simply just be kind to him, essentially, or on side. I'd just be really curious. Your job is a massive job. How do you feel in terms of that juggle of thinking, well, these are just objective standards and I have my professional journalistic standards, and then there is someone like Trump who is so out of the perimeters of those, but then you want to hold Harris to the same one. Just juggling that. I'd just be really curious to know how you felt with that responsibility and balancing that.
Yeah, look, that's a good question. And I think it is our responsibility to hold Harris accountable, to scrutinize her record and her promises and what she would do as president. That doesn't mean that that we're not also doing that of Trump, and it doesn't mean that her her record is the same as Trump's, right? This is not a false equivalence here. Trump has 4 years as president. He says something every day that is controversial, outrageous, untrue, what have you, and that deserves scrutiny that will probably eclipse the scrutiny of her because she's sticking pretty closely to her script. She's a relatively conventional politician, and he's somebody who's not. And a lot of people perceive, understandably, that he is not committed to the Constitution. He has said he would favor the termination of the Constitution. That's his word, termination of the Constitution. That he says being a dictator on day one would be fine with him. Now he says that's a joke, but do you really joke about being a dictator? So I think that you're right that the scrutiny is hard to find that balance because she's not promising to be a dictator or to terminate the Constitution. We shouldn't pretend that these two things are the same. At the same time, it's not we fail in our responsibility if we don't also scrutinize her and report what we see. We follow the facts. If the facts say one thing about one candidate and another thing about another candidate, that's fine. Follow what the facts say.
For both of them, I suppose, if you were to be able to get that, bag that one-on-one interview with Kamala Harris and then also with Trump, I'd say, what do you feel like the top questions for both of them that are missing in your mind?
Well, I think with her, she probably should be challenged a little bit about what she really believes, right? I mean, there were the positions she took in 2019 when she was running for president in a Democratic primary, and she tacked to the left. And those positions she doesn't really seem to hold today, right? So you're trying to figure out, okay, where does she really stand on issues like fracking and Medicare for all and the police and so forth? Was she just saying things that were opportunistic in 2019 that she didn't believe, or is what she's saying now opportunistic because the politics have changed? Having said all that, the other thing I'd like to know is where she feels like she differs from President Biden. Nikki mentioned Gaza. I forgot to reference that, but that's a very good question. Where is she different, if at all, from him on Gaza? That's an important question to talk about. And where is she different from him on all sorts of things, right? Is she a continuation of Biden, which is not what she wants to say because she wants to be the change agent? That's one thing. But on the other hand, she doesn't want to be at odds with him and say, I would have done things differently, because that would seem disloyal. For Trump, I mean, the questions, I think he needs to be challenged on, his fidelity to the Constitution and things like that. I think that he says these things so often and people become inured to them. They're used to them. They've stopped being shocked by them. But in fact, if you actually add up all the different ways he's talked about, blowing up the system, I think that that's worth exploring a little bit more. What does he believe are the limits on power? Right? Does he believe there should be any limits on power? He has made clear, whether he disavows the Project 2025 or not, that he plans to rip up the civil service protections for government employees to have them be more loyal to him. He's already been given immunity by the Supreme Court for criminal actions based off of his official duties. And so I think the nature of power and limitations on power with Trump, go to the heart of his candidacy.
In that vein of questions for Trump and how believable we find him as a person, as a candidate on multiple levels, he said that if he does not win this election cycle, he will not run again. I don't necessarily believe it. I do not see a clear path that the Republican Party would be able to take should Trump bow out of politics, which I don't think he would ever do. But I'd like to get your read on that kind of statement, this idea that this is it for Trump.
Yeah, he said that to Cheryl Atkinson the other day in an interview, right? He wouldn't run in 28 if he loses. I actually think the bigger question is, would he run in 28 if he wins? There's a 2-term limit, but does he actually respect that? That's a question I would like to explore with him a little bit. But you're right. It's a good question. Would he bow out of politics? No, I mean, I don't think he would bow out of politics. It may be that he doesn't run again. I think that, he would be 82. We know that that's, hard on anybody. I think that, one reason he wants to run this time is to, get revenge against his enemies and to avoid prison. And that's, that may not be the same situation in 4 years. And I think it's unheard of, almost unheard of in American politics, not 100% unheard of, but almost unheard of for a political party to give its nomination 3 times in a row to the same candidate after he's lost twice, right? I mean, he would be a 2-time loser at that point, whether he accepts it or not, and a 3-time loser in the popular vote. So that would be really quite, problematic for a political party if it has any hope of winning, to keep nominating the same guy who keeps losing. But that doesn't mean he would bow out. I think he will still be a force in politics no matter what. He will make his position known. He will influence primaries. He will, offer his thoughts to Congress, the Republicans in Congress, about what they should do, and they will either listen to him or won't, but in many cases will. So I don't think he's going away one way or the other.
Do you think that the violence he has been a target of, do you think that has actually spooked him whatsoever? Because it does seem like he's lost a bit of his fighting spirit. I don't know whether that's maybe just because he feels like things aren't going his way. Harris has really changed the race and he's maybe just thrown his toys out the pram a little bit. Or, has that shaken him? Has that made him change the way that he is approaching things? Because I don't think it's made him a more balanced character as we maybe hoped it might, or sort of tempered his way of speaking anyway. But has it spooked him and changed the way that he will approach the race?
Well, I literally just got off the phone with a former aide of his who says that, that there's this talk that there was some PTSD after the first assassination attempt in Butler, where he actually did get hit, grazed, but he got hit in the ear. And you could see how that would affect anybody, right? The idea that you came inches away from being killed would have to affect anybody. Having said that, it lasted for a little while, and I'm not sure it lasted all that long. I mean, I think it may still be part of his conversation or in his own thinking. But in terms of his public, demonstrations, his public comments, his public rallies, and so forth, he's a lot of what he was before that, and I'm not sure I see that huge a difference at this point. But he has been shaken, I think, by Kamala Harris as a candidate, because it clearly wasn't what he expected. He expected to be able to run against Biden. He knew how to do that, as he thought. He was just going to beat up on Biden as an old man and say he was, incapable of doing the job. And you can't say that about Kamala Harris. And he hasn't been able to find traction yet on an argument that really works. Now they're still tied, basically. I mean, she's a little bit ahead, but we should consider these polls to be essentially tied. But he, I think, is having a hard time finding the argument that works for him. And I think that has thrown him off his game a little bit.
I have been thinking a lot about that dynamic, the idea that Harris is what's shaken him more than the two assassination attempts. And the way I see it, it feels almost like in these last few months, Trump has reverted a bit more towards the style of politics and rhetoric he had in 2016. And I think the biggest example of that is everything that he and Vance have been saying about these Haitian migrants, all of the false claims about eating pets and being undocumented, and turning that into really vitriolic calls for mass deportations, that kind of thing. So I think my question here is, and this is also just me like forming it as I talk, is that a sign of how desperate his campaign is right now? This inability to like in any way, shape, or form stick to the messaging his campaign wants and sort of throw muck at the wall to rile up his base in the way that I think was a little more toned down before the 2020 election. Not after the 2020 election, but before.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's interesting to watch him revert to the strategy he thinks worked for him in 2016, right? What worked for him? Build the wall, right? As he sees it, he won because of that in large part. So I've been going back and watching a bunch of his old rallies from the last few months lately.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
It's an experience, and I'm not attending them. I've attended them a lot when he was president. I haven't attended them since then, but it is fascinating to watch them because it really his rally speech is basic. It goes an hour and a half, and it basically is like a one issue campaign. It's border, inflation, border, Kamala, Comrade Kamala, border, crime, border, Ukraine, border. And it's just, he comes back to it again and again and again and again. No matter where his train of thought goes, it eventually leads back to the immigration station. And that's what he seems to think is going to sell his base. Anyway, it doesn't seem to be working with, those relatively small number of uncommitted voters at this point, but he is just, it's a turnout strategy, galvanize your people, get them all worked up, and nothing works them up as far as he can tell more than immigration. And you're right. It's got a racial edge to it, obviously, attack the Haitians and attack Kamala Harris for not being really black, or is she black, or we don't even know if she's black. I mean, that's an old trope, right? He couldn't use it against Joe Biden, the quintessential white dude, but he's going after her in the way he did against Obama and against Hillary Clinton in terms of targeting them. Remember Obama and the birther lie, and then Hillary, she's too weak to be president, meaning she's a woman. And I think that he's returning to first strategy in effect.
I've got one final question for you, and it's a question that every person we speak to absolutely hates me asking. So I'm sorry in advance.
I don't know who's going to win.
Okay, well, that's what I'm going to... What's your gut feeling? Just at the moment, and if you can't give me the kind of gambler's answer, what are you really looking out for? What could shift it? And what are you kind of really keeping an eye on that maybe people who are a bit more laymen, such as myself, might not be noticing?
Well, okay, a couple of things. One is I think we could all go to sleep tonight and wake up in 5 weeks and we will be exactly where we are now, right? So don't worry too much about the daily polls. People are making way too much of a 1 point change here or a 3 point change there, unless you have some big exigent, event like somebody testing a nuclear weapon or something really big that shifts everything. Now, I've heard national security people speculate about that. They're worried about that. Unless you have something like that that dramatically changes the landscape, we're going to be at the same place on November 4th and 5th that we are now, probably, in which we're all guessing because it's going to be so close, especially in these battleground states. Having said that, there are two things. I just got back from Wisconsin, and talking to both Democrats and Republicans, what you hear is that the Democrats do have a better ground game. That, in fact, the Republicans, who have a pretty good history of ground game, haven't deployed it until recently, that they were way behind in getting it set up, whereas the Democrats have been working it pretty heavily for about a year and a half. And that could be the difference. That could make a point difference in a state like a Michigan or a Wisconsin or a Pennsylvania. The second thing I would say is that one thing we can say is that there are a majority of Americans who do not want Donald Trump back as president. Right? I think that's fair to say. He has never had the support of a majority of Americans through his entire political career these last 9 years. He didn't win the popular vote in 2016. He didn't win it in 2020. And he never, for a single day of his presidency, had a support of a majority of the public in a Gallup poll. That's unlike any president in the history of polling, right? Not one day did he have 51% of the public say, I approve the job he's doing in the Gallup polls. So most Americans do not want him back. Nearly a majority do. So it's very tight, but most do not. So the question then is, can Harris get those alienated Biden voters from 2020 who didn't like Trump, voted against Trump, voted for Biden mainly because they were voting against Trump, but then grew disenchanted with Biden because he was too old or because of inflation or the cost of housing or immigration or whatever reason they don't like him as much? Can she bring them back into that Democratic or at least anti-Trump fold? Can she be the acceptable alternative for them? And that's what this next 45 days is about. Can she bring those people over to her side? Nobody's changing their mind. It's all about can she get those disaffected voters to be with her and to turn out.
Peter, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.
Now, some other tales to get into then. We spoke a lot about scandals, Nikki, and we've got to come back to a separate one. This RFK Jr. affair saga that's happening, it seems very odd, but politically, why does it matter? Why is everyone so super focused on this?
Yes. So when I tell you that every group chat I have ever been in was just flabbergasted when this broke.
You've never sent flirty texts to RFK Jr., Nikki?
No, I haven't.
Oh,
Should I
what?
start that?
Yeah,
if my editors are listening. No, I'm kidding. So what happened here is a year ago in November of 2023, New York Magazine's Olivia Nuzzi profiled RFK Jr. She went to his home in, I think, Brentwood, California, met with him in person. It was not a very glowing profile. She described his car as smelling like dead animal, which now, given everything we know about RFK, completely makes sense.
I bet it fucking did.
At some point after that meeting, it is believed, Olivia Nuzzi and RFK Jr. began what has been described by Olivia, who is a very prominent DC reporter. She is the White House correspondent or Washington, D.C. correspondent for New York Magazine, as a virtual affair.
Whoa.
So sexting, texting, the provision of nude photographs. The way this broke was last week, Oliver Darcy, formerly of CNN, who has now launched his own newsletter, broke the news that editors at New York Magazine had learned about this improper relationship and put Nuzzi on leave while they conducted an investigation into her subsequent reporting, because she has been reporting on the election over the past year. It is fundamentally a massive breach of journalistic ethics. You do not fuck around with a source or a subject. It is, and I wrote about this a bit for Rolling Stone, but we've talked about it. There is a lot of distrust in the media right now. People do not trust the relationships reporters have with sources. They do not trust that reporters are being honest. It is incredibly difficult to maintain standards in the current environment in the United States within the media. On another level, like, there are so many men on this planet.
Yeah.
If you're going to throw away your career, pick someone better than RFK.
In a sort of adjacent story, but also completely not, there's a new dog scandal on the scene, and it's not RFK Jr. this
It's
time.
not
Even though his
RFK
car
Jr.
allegedly smells like dead animals, this wasn't him. What's this Project 2025 dog story that's going on?
Yeah. So we've talked about Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, before.
Mm-hmm.
Heritage Foundation is the conservative think tank that produced Project 2025.
Uh-huh.
So The Guardian reported earlier this week that when Kevin Roberts was a professor at New Mexico State University, he went to a dinner party where he described beating his neighbor's dog to death with a shovel.
Fuck me.
Yeah. Yeah. Because apparently,
Why?
like,
Why did he say this?
yeah, because
Why?
so one of the sources the Guardian spoke to, who was chair of the university's history department at that time, said that, quote, "My recollection of his account was that he was discussing in the hallway with various members of the faculty, including me, that a neighbor's dog had been barking pretty relentlessly and was, keeping the baby and probably the parents awake, and that he kind of lost it and took a shovel and killed the dog. End of problem." End quote. And
These
yeah.
guys, man.
Yeah. And what the sources who the Guardian spoke to indicate is that the dog had never really like threatened or been like aggressive toward members of the family. It was just barking a lot. They managed to track down the neighbors, and the neighbor did confirm that one of his dogs had gone missing in that time period and that they had never found her. But he said that like he couldn't say that Roberts was the one who actually did it, but he was like, yeah, my dog went missing around that time and like we never found her.
Okay, well, at least this this adds, I suppose, doesn't it, in the context, in the serious context of it. We already knew that Project 2025 was a little bit unhinged. Maybe if this is the guy who's sort of at the top, think twice about the whole thing. Final thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is, we've talked a lot about celeb endorsements and whether Taylor Swift, what she said, matters and blah, 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 blah. Chapel Roan, who is a favourite of the podcast. I think we love Chapel Roan fans. Yeah, she's very good at the music thing. But she's being questioned over the not music thing at the moment and politics. Why? And what have you made to the whole thing? And does it just seem strange to you that she's been held to such a massive standard, and as if everyone in the arts as well should just unblinkingly support Kamala Harris and the Democrats, and if they don't, they're evil?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Chapel Roan has pretty much outright refused to endorse Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
To be clear, Chapel Roan hates Donald Trump and has said publicly that she is voting for Kamala Harris. What she is not willing to do, in her words, is put her name and project behind Harris's campaign because she fundamentally disagrees with some of the positions Harris holds, in particular, Gaza.
Yeah.
At her concerts on her tour, Chapel Roan has been fundraising for Palestinian aid. She has been very public about disagreeing with the stance the Democratic Party and Democrats have taken on Gaza. She has also said that she feels Democrats need to do more to help trans people, LGBTQ people. And I think the thing here is there was a quote which was taken out of context by like Pop Crave or one of those like Twitter accounts that just parrot celebrity gossip, where they highlighted a piece of a quote where she said there were problems, or that both parties had problems. And people took that as her saying that both parties are equal, which is not what she was saying if you look at the full context of her statement. But I think the thing with celebrity endorsements and celebrities in general is that a lot of people want celebrities to be mouthpieces for their own ideologies and their own beliefs. And at the end of the day, celebrities are people. Like, they're allowed to have political opinions. They're allowed to have political stances. And Chappell Roan doesn't owe anyone an endorsement. She doesn't owe Kamala Harris an endorsement because she's been using her songs in her TikTok videos. Like, that's not how this works.
No.
We've criticized Harris's policy on Gaza. Plenty of people have. I don't think Chappell Roan's position is really out of line with what a lot of Democrats are feeling, where they are perfectly willing to vote for Kamala Harris, even though they might fundamentally disagree with some of her policy positions, because they know objectively that Trump will be worse for any of the communities that they're concerned about. In the United States, all over the world, people tend to have these really unhealthy parasocial relationships with celebrities, where we kind of expect celebrities to act and feel and think in a way that makes us comfortable rather than what they actually believe. And I think Chappell, in all of her public statements, has been very clear that she just wants to be left alone and do her own thing, and that if you like her shit, cool. If you don't, whatever. She doesn't care. But I think it's silly. I think she's done a lot to bring attention to the issue of Palestine. I think she is a wonderful advocate for the LGBTQ community. And for people to just like turn on her in this manner over something that is objectively pretty normal, and I think reflects the way that a lot of people in the Democratic Party feel right now, it's dumb.
On that note, that brings us to the end of American Friction. I'm sorry, we're going to retire Chris's number time in his honor. Get better soon, Chris. He's only got like a cold or something. I don't know. I'm being very melodramatic. But yeah, we're just retiring it. You've had some polling. You've had some numbers at the top. You know, Peter mentioned numbers. I mentioned numbers. We're all good. Nikki, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jarv.
Thank you. And Chris, thanks. You're not here. And normally Chris thanks me, but Nikki just thanks me. So thank you, everyone. And an even bigger thank you to all of you, the listeners, tuning in. If you want more from us, we're out with a new episode every Friday, early afternoon if you're in the UK, and in the morning if you're stateside. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Our name on each platform is @AmericanFrick, and we're on YouTube as well. Search American Friction to find us. And a quick reminder, if you enjoy what we're doing, please do rate and review us wherever you're listening to the show, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You've been listening to American Friction. We'll see you next week.